I'm Jo Tovey, and this is the Full Story Newsroom Edition. Well, after years of angst about how expensive housing has become in Australia, this week the media was gripped by a fresh panic. House prices are falling, at least a little. Now, there's a few reasons for that, but the responsibility is being laid pretty squarely at the feet of the Albanese government and their recent budget, particularly the changes to negative gearing and capital gains tax driving investors out of the market. Today, we are going to unpack what is going on, why, and the diabolical political conundrum of trying to solve a housing affordability crisis without bringing down house prices. With us today is Patrick Keneally.
Thanks. I'm glad I'm not Jim Chalmers having to deal with all of this.
And Gabrielle Jackson.
The first column I ever wrote after I started at The Guardian in 2015 was about house prices, and I'm still using the same talking points.
And joining us this week as well, we have business editor Jonathan Barrett.
I'm looking forward to discussing every Australian's favourite topic, the property market.
Let's get into it. So before we get into the politics of this, let's just outline a bit of what's happening. So, Jonathan, can you tell us what has happened to house prices lately and how much of that is due to the budget and how much of it is other factors?
Well, we have the budget on May 12, and by the end of the month, there are flat prices across the country, but we do see some falls in Sydney and Melbourne. And of course, nuance is the first casualty of a political debate. So those prices were falling in the lead up to the budget. And we have these other really big issues going on in the economy, namely 3 consecutive interest rate rises, stretched household budgets, and a conflict in Iran. So it's difficult to kind of apportion what is driving some small declines in Sydney and Melbourne, but it will be having an impact because, or particularly Sydney, has been quite a market that investors have really liked.
Just on that, you mentioned nuance. I think it's important not to get too carried away here. You know, back in 2020, everybody during COVID was like, house prices are going to fall, but they did the exact opposite and they went up 35%. And I saw some modelling from CBA come out yesterday that showed that, there's going to be, it's forecasting a drop of around 5% in Sydney, 7% in Melbourne this year, but then next year, they climb again by 3%. It may just be a temporary blip. We don't know at this stage. And I think it's important not to catastrophize.
Patrick. So let's get into the politics of this now. So it has really blown up as an issue this week. The Australian has referred to the budget as a wrecking ball through the economy. A number of commentators had meltdowns after Jim Chalmers said it was a good thing that first home buyers might be being given a crack at auctions where clearance rates have fallen. What are the risks and rewards for a government presiding over an era of falling house prices?
I think there's a big risk for the government here. Households, like real estate property, is the biggest source of wealth for Australians. 60% of our wealth in Australia is tied up in property and real estate, and that's much higher than the OECD average, which is around 50%. In places like the US, it's even lower at 30%. So for years, people have banked on real estate being their major source of wealth, particularly into retirement. The knock-on effect of if house prices fall, even by a little bit, it affects people's feelings about how wealthy they are and their consumer confidence more broadly, I think. And at a moment where people, particularly like Gen Xers, who have been paying mortgages and thinking, I'm going to get ahead at one point, if you give them that kind of knock, perhaps that feeds in more to this sense of disenfranchisation, or that's probably not the right word, but this sense of alienation, of anger against the government and probably towards One Nation and the kind of fringe parties as well.
What do you think, Gabs?
I think it's a really narrow path for the government. Like, everyone knows, we've been talking about it for a long time, for over 10 years, that house prices are too expensive for young people. But falling house prices in a country where 2/3 of people own a house with or without a mortgage is dangerous. And no one wants to see, people losing value in their house and suddenly people having negative equity. Even people scared about having negative equity in their house can be dangerous for the economy. People stop going out, unemployment rises, banks foreclosing people's homes is a life-changing event for them, but a terrible look politically. So yes, you do want house prices to stop growing at such an astronomical pace, but you don't want them to fall so much that it creates a set of economic circumstances that are disastrous for everyone.
There are sort of questions of degrees here, right, though, like how much they fall by what is a sort of a catastrophic fall and what is a very minor correction. Like this is a country where house prices rose nearly 10% last year. Like even if we're talking about 10%, I think is one of the bigger numbers I've heard being bandied about. We're only talking about going back to prices at the beginning of, say, 2025, right? So how serious a sort of an issue do you think we're looking at here?
We do need to get into perspective. So the Treasury modelling thinks that the tax changes will have a 2 percentage point drag on prices. AMP has 5 percentage points. And then throwing in all these other factors, including inflation, the biggest prediction we have is a 10% drop, which would take us back to nationally, the drum roll, March 2025. So we do need to take that into perspective. Of course, if you are someone who bought around then that might be a little bit painful. You will be feeling poorer, but it's very hard to get reforms in that is advantageous to everybody. And
as Chalmers said, housing's supposed to be a medium or long-term investment. So if they fall 1 year, but over the course of you living in that, they go up, then it's not a bad investment.
The reforms are supposed to tilt the tables back, like getting first homeowners having a leg up over investors, or the other way around, investors not having a leg up over first homeowners. And so if in some markets, in particular Sydney, where investors have been so active, even if a few at each auction pull out or don't turn up, like it has to have a drag on prices. And that's exactly what the reforms are designed to do. But I mean, the big thing is we still have a massive undersupply issue in Australia. And so there are factors that mean that even if is a bit of a drop, you'd have to question how far it can fall.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The fundamentals of the market haven't really changed. Like we have reasonably high population growth, which has clicked over to 28 million people in Australia this week, according to the ABS. Constrained supply, and there's just not enough houses. The supply and demand equation hasn't really changed fundamentally here.
The other fact I think that it's important to get our heads around is that the market could not keep growing at that pace out of proportion to wages and expect there to be a miraculous solution.
There's also political risks at growing at the rate that it has. Like we talk about how discontent with price falls could feed one nation, which I absolutely think is possible. But conversely, price rises the way they were. If you hear One Nation voters talking about why they're so angry at the system, why they think Australia is essentially broken, one of the key things they keep saying is, my kids can't afford to buy a house. That is like a fundamental driver of grievance politics in Australia. So isn't doing structural reform short-term sort of pain for long-term gain from the perspective of the major parties and particularly Labor?
Yeah, I think so. It's important to remember where we've come from and where we are now. Like in the 1990s, houses were about 2.5 times household income, annual household income. We're now at the kind of 6 times, depending on where you live, or even higher.
Closer to 12 in Sydney.
I think we're, depending on where you are. But so that's a big social change in where we are, and we're getting to the point in Australia where people feel the only way that you are able to get into a house or own a house is through coming from a family where there's inherited wealth, and what that does for a society. So there were risks if we didn't change this equation, serious risks, I think, of further alienating people and also injecting risk into the whole system. The more you build up this kind of investment, the more structural risk you create, because we have one of the highest levels of debt per capita in the OECD as well, because we are borrowing huge amounts of money to invest in real estate because the prices keep on moving up. And what does that do to an economy if we're all over leveraged, have low amounts of disposable income and can't spend it anywhere else?
And ideally the government would want to have house prices rising at a slower rate and incomes rising faster. And that's how we get better affordability. But it's a market. You just cannot kind of put those perfect parameters, and it's going to be a little bit messy.
But even that would take decades for it to catch up. Where to get to where we were in 1990.
Yeah, that's right. So we wrote a piece back around the last election in 2025, Patrick Commons, our economics editor, who said that even if home values rose at the modest level of 2.5%, which is the Reserve Bank's target inflation rate, and wages were assumed to be growing at about 3.5% a year, it would take 70 years of this path of sustainable growth for the house to price income ratio to go back down to 6.5%, which is what it was, 6.5 times the average income, which is what it was at the turn of the century. If house price growth was flat, it would take 20 years. That's a long time to be waiting for housing affordability.
And I think that's fed into a lot of, Gen, what are they? Why? Gen Z?
Gen Z.
Gen Zs.
Yeah.
The feeling that they'll never own a property. And, and what does that mean for their politics? What does that mean for, all the markers of adulthood, owning a home, forming a family, all those markers of adulthood have just been pushed back into much later in life.
But we're acting like politics is rational, and I don't think it always is. The Generation Z and millennials are not happy about these changes that will most benefit them, and that, I think, is the most difficult thing that the government has to deal with right now.
I think that's really interesting. So we know from polling, Gen Z and millennials tend to be a bit more in favour of this budget than older generations. But yeah, particularly among millennials, there is a high level of unfavourability. How do we sort of understand that, given that these policies are very clearly pitched at those people?
It's about aspiration, isn't it? And it's a very powerful political argument to say that this is robbing you or the next generations of aspiration. So I'm not sure if people aspire to negatively gear properties, but
I think they do.
Yeah, they've probably looked at their parents and thought, look, after I get a home, then I might be able to get a property and build a portfolio. And even with these prices, that's probably not going to happen without a sizable inheritance. It's a powerful political argument.
And how much do you think that message maybe also have been clouded by the fact that these tax changes aren't just about the housing market, that they apply to other forms of investment, which, Gen Z and millennials may have been looking to as their, chance to build wealth?
I have to say, I'm actually surprised younger people care about trusts. It's interesting that might have got a bit of traction. And once again, I'm not sure people would necessarily be able to articulate why they don't like the changes on things like trusts or share portfolios with their CGT changes. But there's just the opponents of these reforms have done a pretty good job of just saying, well, this is going to harm you in the long run.
We are still 2 years from an election, though, and the government has a chance here to actually go out and meet these arguments about why they've made the changes and what it will do. And, if the comeback modelling that I mentioned earlier, if that holds true and we do see, prices maybe moderate or dip this year but then climb next year, will people's feelings about it change?
And if we see a big influx of first home buyers get in, and I can disclose I bought a house 3 weeks ago.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We got it for significantly under the reserve because there just weren't that many people bidding. It was still exorbitantly expensive, a house in inner Sydney, out of reach of most people. And, I think we paid a lot of money, but it was less than we would have paid in January because I looked at house price sales on the same street because, interest is a bit depressed.
I think it's worth talking about the aspiration a little bit more because it's such a tricky thing to talk about in politics, because I think that's true. And yet we're not seeing this mass support about it. Peter Lewis wrote a great piece about the aspiration paradox a couple of years ago in relation to the superannuation changes. And he described it as like the proclivity of people to vote for the sort of life they wish they had or think they might have rather than the life that they're materially actually living right now. now. And I think we see it play out in so many different ways. And the best example I've ever read about this was actually about an American story. And the UN Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty, who's actually an Australian academic, Philip Alston, was in America, and a Guardian journalist went around with him. It was when Trump first came in, they just delivered sweeping tax changes to the wealthiest people in America while increasing taxes for some really poor families. And he was going around Skid Row talking to all these homeless people. And they spoke to this woman who was living in a tent for over a decade, had her child removed from her, didn't have any form of welfare or income other than recycling plastic bottles. And they asked her about the American dream, that if you work hard enough, you can get ahead. And she totally believed in that dream. She was like, I know I'm going to make it one day. I'm really going to make it. And I think that is and homeless people after homeless person said the same thing. And I think that's what the government is now up against. So many Australians have been raised with the idea that the Australian dream is to not only own your home, but to have one that's negatively geared as well. And so it has to be more than logic. And you are benefiting. Why are you not happy about this? It has to be a story.
The media has a role here too, though, doesn't
Absolutely.
it, in telling this story accurately and not kind of catastrophizing, as you alluded to earlier, in keeping things in perspective, and also in telling diverse, bringing forward the experiences of a diverse range of Australians. I think the media debate is always a bit skewed by the fact that the commentariat tends to be older homeowners, people who might own investment properties. We don't hear from people who might be living in social housing. We don't hear from sort of forever renters, and we don't hear from young people as much. So I think that's got to be a part of this as well, that this conversation is somewhat being driven by people for whom owning an investment property is just a part of life. But that's not true of everyone in Australia.
Yeah.
It may be an aspiration, but it's not the reality.
And I think Greg Jericho wrote that great column a couple of weeks ago about, of all the things that everybody's getting outraged in the budget this time around, it's CGT and, negative gearing, not huge cuts to the NDIS that are going to affect people's lives. Why are we not talking about, for example, as you mentioned, social housing, which there really wasn't much in the budget for that. Labor's tried to do a bit, but really it's very incremental. And, what are we doing for rent assistance? What are we doing for people who are really on the margins here? I think that there's been some, intense focus on obviously house prices, but it's important to take a wider view as well.
We're used to seeing wealthy people have the loudest voices in mainstream media, right? And whenever there's any change that might mean that rich people might not be able to accumulate wealth at quite the same pace that they have, we see hysteria.
The Dave Hugheses of this world.
I mean, really, it's amazing. It surprises me every time, even though it shouldn't. But what surprised me this time was how maybe it was organised. Social media has been flooded with young people going, oh my God, this is the end of my life.
I think in some ways that's hard to detect the signal from the noise in that. We don't know on social media, those kind of algorithms promote those kind of voices, whether it's a more genuinely held thing. And I don't know if the polling is necessarily granular enough to really understand what young people are feeling about this budget. And also, do people follow the budget that closely that they, know the details of it? I think it's a vibe.
As our economics editor, Patrick Common, said, they don't have to understand it.
If
they see the budget is terrible, is terrible day after day, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
The danger politically, look, if things do settle down in terms of the economy and in terms of the house prices, then over the next couple of years, then that'll be good for Labor, and it'll show that some of this was a lot of unfounded fear. But the real danger is, particularly on global issues or big macro issues like inflation, if prices do start tumbling and we have these kind of sour kind of economic conditions, then it's all going to get placed on these reforms, even if another interest rate rise or another one after that, even if they are the things that are depressing prices, there's a big danger for the government here.
It was good to see Albanese this week actually putting up a bit of a fight for these changes. It reminds you that when he wants to, he can kind of really sell an idea. I don't know how much they trickled through.
Yeah, look, Jim Chalmers is a reasonable salesman as well. I think the government's got a range of voices out there trying to promote the budget, but again, they're just not being heard in a lot of the media.
We're talking a lot about the risks for the government here, but what do you make of the risks of the coalition's policy, which is essentially sticking with the old status quo? They're going to go to an election promising that and instead focusing on migration and housing, which is also the sort of link One Nation is trying to draw. How popular and palatable do you think that argument looks now?
I think for the coalition's base, negative gearing is probably still going to remain popular. There's that famous quote that gets wheeled out quite regularly in this debate about John Howard saying in the late 1990s or early 2000s, no one's ever come to me to complain that the value of my house is going up. So I think most of their base would be attached to this idea that you invest in property, it generates wealth.
It's a small base, though, these days.
It is a small base, and a lot of it's drifting towards One Nation, which has a vague policy around this. But where the coalition has tried to go is talking about trying to link immigration with basically with new builds of housing and saying that they want that to stay at the same rate. There's some pretty big flaws in the methodology and the kind of logic behind their thing, which we've reported on. But they're keen to sort of say, don't look at negative gearing. The real problem is immigration and supply.
I just want to talk we've talked a little bit about who materially does stand to benefit from here, which is, potentially first home buyers on the cusp of being able to afford a home. Who are the potential, I guess, losers outside the sort of, the uber wealthy sort of property investor? Is there a risk that, you could see, people on sort of middle income slipping into negative equity and sort of, serious effects across the economy from that?
Yeah, the negative equity question has gained a lot of traction as well. So it's mainly referring to those who bought with a 5% deposit very recently over the last year or so. I mean, if they're going to live there long term and they've got a secure job and the employment market's pretty strong in Australia, I mean, it's not the end of the world. But it is an example that with any reform, there are people that are worse off. Other people, those reforms it's all been grandfathered, so you have an older generations that may have been able to lock in several investment properties and have, and keep those negative gearing advantages. I would say just the age group below that who may have about to take that next step, and that's quite a considerable kind of middle-aged cohort, maybe thinking I've just been robbed of this chance that I've seen others take. So, there are more than a few people who this won't necessarily benefit.
And there are people who have their own businesses and distribute the income through trusts, or people who have passive income that have, had the capital gains tax discount all this time. They are going to have to pay more tax. That's how societies should work. You shouldn't earn more as a hedge fund manager. You shouldn't be taxed less as a hedge fund manager than a nurse.
Yeah, the trust system where you can kind of allocate money out to kids and pay less tax. I mean, just pay it. I don't have a lot of empathy there. The government should be able to prosecute that case.
Do you think these issues are all getting mixed up together though, like the CGT changes and property prices, negative gearing? It just feels like one.
I did see a young woman in the Daily Telegraph this week saying that she was really angry that she was going to start her business and she was going to earn money that would then have to be taxed. And I was like,
welcome to the wage earners world.
That's not a bad thing.
Yeah. But this kind of raised that whole point of, what do we as voters want? We just want a system where houses are more affordable, but they're going to continue to rise and we're going to make a lot of money, and we want more people being able to afford to be in a home, but also want a big investment portfolio. Like, we're into this very strange
And this gets back
world.
to that conundrum of, did people really think housing affordability was a problem they wanted to solve or not? Did they just want to sort of keep giving leg ups and more kind of inflationary measures to get more people into an overheated market? In
my 2015 column, which I don't recommend people go back and read, it's a bit embarrassing, I quoted the head of ANZ saying there is an irrational obsession with housing as an investment class in Australia. And I think that's the thing. Like, when you invest in shares, you might lose money, but no one else loses. When you create housing as an investment, you are robbing other people of the right to have basic need, which is shelter. And that's what we don't talk about enough in this country when we're obsessed with housing as an investment.
But I guess, like, if you're investing in new housing, which the government has encouraged, and, you're still able to negative gear, you're not robbing someone else. You're investing in, the creation of new housing, which I think is a clever design with this policy. And I think all these things, like young people saying, I can't negative gear, you can actually. You just got to buy new housing and invest in new supply, which is, a good policy proposal from the government in this area. Yeah.
We might have to leave it there. Before we take a quick break, if you have a question for us or a story you think is not getting enough attention, we do want to hear from you. Shoot us an email at australia.fullstory.com and we'll be right back. And now it's time for what we can't get out of our head. Gabs, what was it for you this week?
Well, for me, it's This American Life and how great it is. I went back and listened to a 2008 episode called The Giant Pool of Money, which was like the seminal piece of journalism on the subprime mortgage crisis at that time, which was so hard to understand. But it just reminded me that putting people at the heart of your story can make even the most boring, dry stories really fascinating, and you can really explain complicated things. It was just such a great episode. It stands the test of time, and I was really I didn't know this before, but I realised that actual episode was the inspiration for the whole Planet Money podcast, which was the inspiration for our Who Screwed Millennials podcast.
Hopefully we're not in line for a 2008 subprime mortgage drama.
I don't think we're there yet, but like, it was instructive, you know. It really reminded me why, like, it's not in our best interests for people to be like having lots of negative equity in their homes.
Jonathan, what was it for you this week?
Oh, I liked Bridget Delaney's opinion piece, and the headline says it all. When was the last time you just hung out with friends? And it talks about these long, unstructured hangouts rather than going to dinner or something like that. And that really transported me, as someone who was a teenager and young adult in the 90s. It transported me to the 90s sitcoms like Seinfeld, like Friends. They just seemed to have all this time to hang out. And I think a lot of my generation, they wanted to do that as well, but it's actually quite difficult to do.
It's really difficult. The other part of the headline was, in brackets, and I don't mean a dinner booked 2 months in advance, which I felt was a personal attack as somebody who has a dinner with Bridget that we booked 2 months in advance coming up. But it's really hard, isn't it? Like, friends, it's not like your 20s where you're all kind of living in share houses or a few suburbs close together. Like, a lot of us have kids. People live far apart. The housing crisis has certainly meant that my friendship group is sort of scattered to the winds across the state these days. I hang out, I think, with people who live in my very local area. I get coffee with like our kids at the park. But apart from that, it's really hard. Yeah,
and I think it's particularly hard for men in this area as well. They're less good at saying, do you want to just go for a walk or something like that? We'll go to the pub, we'll watch football, or,
you have to take up golf, Patrick.
Yeah, maybe take up golf. I'm sure that would be pretty unpopular, spending all Saturday out on the golf course. But no, it is difficult. And I remember, spending at university in my late teens, just, days with, you didn't have any money, so you couldn't go and do anything, but you had a lot of time, so you could just hang out and, we played handball. We did even into our 20s. It was like, it was fun because you just hung out all the time, but you don't do that, isn't it?
It's something that my partner who moved here from Iran in his 20s always says to me, like, there's something wrong with Australian men being able to form new friendships. Like, all his Australian male friends are friends from school or something like that, and he found it very hard. He had to go and join local soccer clubs in order to make friends.
It's all about hobbies.
Yeah.
All right, well, we will have to leave it there, friends. Thank you for joining us today, Gabs.
Thank you for having me.
And Patrick.
Thanks, Joe.
And Jonathan.
Thanks, Joe.